Well, I'm 45 years old, and when I was 42, one of the things that I do is I work with United Ways, and I make animation to help them advocate for the importance of third grade reading. And one of my United Way clients was interested in potentially using data for dyslexia. So I started doing some research on data for dyslexia, and within about 10, 15 minutes, 95% of the riddles I had about myself were instantly answered. And just like right now, I have still problems with word recall and things like that just I couldn't understand that I'd struggle with my whole life. So I went to the internet and went in dyslexia in Madison, and I called Wild and got a really nice phone call back from Irv, and it's changed my life. A nice sort of dyslexia story that I think what you're talking about is my father and I were actually the first father and son ever to graduate from the University of Wisconsin. He was 34 years old, and I was 34 years old. He was 70 years old. And the reason why that is he went to school in the 50s and I went to school in the 80s. And you know what? We couldn't get through those foreign languages. And we both weren't diagnosed with dyslexia. So, and if you look at my transcript, you'd think that I was an enthusiast of foreign languages because I have 1 or 2 years of 6 languages, including Russian and Chinese and pretty much everything. So, so my father and I could not get through the foreign language requirement. So we ended up going back when we were 34, when I was 34 years old and he was 70, and I ended up taking Latin, which I didn't have to speak. And he ended up taking 1 semester of Swedish, which was really, really hard for him, but he was very dedicated. So sort of the backdrop of that is I did have a degree in history, but I always struggled with reading. I couldn't understand why I couldn't remember sounds. Or why when I read a book, I couldn't rote memorize like others. And it was always very, very difficult for me because as much as I love words and I am a professional writer, I've always had a hard time with them. So it's been kind of a double-edged sword. So it was interesting coming to Wild and figuring and learning that I was dyslexic, to learn that I didn't read like other people. And part of the gift of dyslexia and being here at Wild is understanding that it's a trade-off of skills. That while there's certain things that non-dyslexics are good at or better at, the speed and accuracy of communications, there's things that dyslexics have an advantage of. One of them being some of their strengths are conceptual thinking, visual thinking, and sort of the creative world. And so that's what got me here. Oh, and actually I came here and I spoke with Irv, who put me in touch with an evaluator. And so I talked to Nira, and we went through 2 months of test taking, and that's first how we discovered dyslexia, and then she recommended that I come back here to Irv and take some classes. For professionally, I work with data, so I blend data into animated stories and regarding education. So I'm obviously very fascinated in data when it comes to dyslexia. And it is surprising the sheer number of people, creative people that do have dyslexia that have found out later in their lives. One of the most interesting data points I've heard is, in England, Irv, that 85% of everybody that at some point was captain, men and women, of a high school sports team is dyslexic. 85%. You know why that is? Because when you grow up being dyslexic, often kids have to find other people to communicate for them, or they communicate differently, which generally puts them in leadership positions, because it's easier for the dyslexic to get other people to sort of, and they learn sort of skill sets to sort of come on board with their way of thinking, because it's easier for them to do that than the other. They're also very good talent evaluators, and but they have natural leadership. I'm a bit of an introvert anyway, so one-on-one is always better. than trying to, follow the teacher or follow like, a group of people. Sometimes, unless I'm, highly engaged, I can get sort of lost. But, especially I'm pretty sure you handpicked her for me, and she was perfect. It was somebody that was a perfect match for me in every way. And, same age, she was very smart, and she was able to, again, adapt the program to me. And what was great that you were able to do is, because I finished up early on some of the parts of the program that you led us at the end, encouraged us to work on my writing and build in, processes, so forth like that I could be more efficient, that have really paid off. One of the jokes that I make about myself that is very true is that I say the worst thing that ever happened in my life was making the 7th grade basketball team. It sounds kind of funny and ridiculous, but I grew up in Indiana, and Indiana basketball is like hockey is in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So needless to say, it's very, very competitive. And in high school, in 7th and 8th grade, when you make the team, it's very competitive. And needless to say, your social status goes up a little bit. Before I made the team, the two things that I loved doing was I'd make movies. My dad had one of the first VCRs. It was like 80 pounds, and you'd carry it up here in a big back. My friend and I would make animated movies and sketches and so forth like that. The other thing I loved doing was I was the first one of my friends that got the Apple II Plus. And I used to go to Radio Shack and wait in line and wait for my turn and just code, and I loved all that stuff. So when I made the basketball team, I pretty much turned all of the backs on my natural interests. And where am I now? Being 45 years old, after sort of wandering in the woods for 30 years, trying to figure out what I was really good at and what I loved doing, was right back to before I made the basketball team, which was technology. I work in technology, and I make movies. So, and I think the takeaway from that is, if I had known when I was 11, 12 years old that I was, or even younger, that I was dyslexic, not only would I would have done better at school, I would have understood myself, and I would have understood, my parents would have known that these are my natural abilities and interests. I'm a visual thinker, I'm creative, that when I went down my path on how I thought about myself and what careers would be interested in me, I would have taken filmmaking more seriously. I would have wouldn't have let go of computers, things that right now I love doing and I'm very good at. And I think it was a real missed opportunity that, back then in the late 80s, there wasn't a whole lot of people didn't know, and there weren't a whole lot of resources for dyslexia. And frankly, my parents at the time, were pretty much, well, just try harder at school, and, was on the school because, I was doing very well, on my SATs and otherwise, especially math, and my IQ tests were very good, but I really, really struggled with reading. And it's something that just never got diagnosed, and so I met you. I'm a much happier human being now, frankly, because Wild. Again, my journey with Wild at my age, I can't underestimate the importance of understanding dyslexia and how that makes me who I am. So now I understand this part of myself, and I also have done strategies that have helped me with my professional life. I do a lot of speaking. There would be some words that, or names of companies, or something that I would reference or have to reference that I frankly wouldn't reference, because I knew, especially if I was a little nervous when I had to say this word, like Sardovia or something like that, that I didn't even know how to sort of attack the word and write it down so I could, pronounce it. Now that's not a problem at all, and it's something that I spend way too much anxiety on beforehand. I also, one of the things I do, even like, people take it for granted, like a short email. I've learned that a 3-sentence email, especially to somebody who's pretty important, or I'm reaching out to, or I want to make a very good impression, sometimes it would take me 4 hours to write it, because I would get locked up and I wouldn't know exactly sort of what to put. And just little things like having a timer and doing a draft. And the last thing that I learned from your class is read it out loud. Because once I read it out loud, I will hear any mistakes that my visually I won't pick up. So those are just a few examples of how it's helped me out. And frankly, I've learned that that there are just some things that, again, it's a trade-off of skills. Being dyslexic, I'll be, like, visually I'll always be very strong at. And there are areas that I need patched up, that I've patched up through whether it's business, bringing in vendors that are good at these things, or understanding that doing churning out a whole bunch of emails or communications that aren't essential, or building a template and then modifying it for 20 different people. So just building in strategies where I am more efficient using technology and using other people. And so it frees me up to do things that I'm good at and that I should be spending time as opposed to spending 90% of the time, trying to, do, communications and so forth that I wasn't really good at, I think adults, it's equally important, I think, for both parties. I think for adults, as I think I've said, knowing a person smarter than me said the key of happiness is knowing thyself. And it would have been impossible for me to understand who I am and to be happy if I didn't have this breakthrough and understand dyslexia and get the training that I did. It's absolutely essential. Now, it's actually more important for kids, I think. I've told you about the example of me missing 30 years of what I should have been doing all along, that I had to find accidentally on my way, into my 40s. I wish I would have known that when I was younger. I think the most difficult thing that, me being a dyslexic growing up, that was really difficult was dyslexics typically score well in IQ tests, and they're generally known as smart. However, when their parents are getting feedback that they are smart, but they're struggling in subjects, what happens? You're not working hard enough. You're being lazy. You're spending too much time doing this, And so your parents think that you're not applying yourself, you're not lazy, and that you're lazy. And the worst part about it is you start believing that. You must be lazy, and it really shoots your self-esteem. And kids as young as 4-year-olds understand when they fall behind compared to the rest of their classes in reading that their self-esteem suffers greatly. So figuring out as soon as possible and understanding in a positive way what dyslexia is, and to compete in this world, you can do anything, but you need the skill sets. You need to be able to read information and to write and do all those things effectively and communicate effectively. I would argue more so now than at any time in history. So it's very, very important at a young age. And the last thing I'll say this, having young kids of my own, is I think it's helpful it being out of the school, something that's different, something that you can work on with your child at night, whether it's remotely or to come in here, where where they can get focused attention, a program tailored to their specific needs outside the school, where things don't get all sort of tangled up, and also where they might they don't have to kind of deal with some of the labels and so forth like that can really hurt some kids. So I just like to finish up and I love to see you blush, but Irv, you're a wonderful guy, and it's tough. It's tough calling somebody up, when you're 43 years old and you have got some questions, and you're just you're somebody I admire very much for what you've built here and what you've given the community, what you've given to me, and I think your whole program resonates from that fact. Yeah, it's one of the best decisions I made in my life was to coming to Wild.